Welcome back to Land Matters, the podcast of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. I'm your host, Anthony Flint. Well, the tragedy of the coronavirus pandemic is seen in so many ways, beginning with the incredible human death toll, more than 1 million worldwide and over 210,000 in the U.S. alone, economies in turmoil, staggering job losses, huge reductions in GDP. The impact of the virus ripples through virtually all aspects of daily life, from schools to retail, and as we've seen, coursing through the White House and afflicting the president and top leadership. But for some time now, there's one part of this crisis that has economists and many others particularly worried: how state and local governments are going to make it through. The problem is simple. State and local governments mostly fund themselves using tax revenues from various sources to provide services and perform all the functions most of us take for granted day to day, whether processing driver's licenses or teaching our children. But COVID has dramatically cut those revenues, about $200 billion by some estimates, just for 2020. And exactly at the same time, the need for extra services and assistance, starting with health and hospitals, but also transit systems without passengers, small businesses without customers, schools that need makeovers to stay safe, you name it. Well, that need has never been greater. It's a crisis, after all. State and local governments, to their credit, have sprung into action. They're spending unprecedented amounts of money to deal both with COVID and with the resulting recession. And so with expenditures up and revenues down, state officials from coast to coast are anticipating budget gaps of at least 20%. And by the way, unlike the federal government, nearly all state governments and most local governments are required to balance their budgets each year. What about another federal stimulus package? Thus far, cities and states got about $200 billion. And another $400+ billion was in the $2.2 trillion bill passed by the House. But then President Trump abruptly called off negotiations, and then he reversed himself, and the White House proposed a $1.8 trillion package. But Senate Republicans balked at spending that much money. As messes go, this is a big one. Thankfully, for this episode of Land Matters, we have two leading experts on government finance to help us all understand what's going on and what the future might hold. Daphne Kenyon is an economist and a longtime fellow at the Lincoln Institute who's done extensive research on the property tax, the use of property tax breaks for business location, payments in lieu of taxes, and the funding of local public school systems. Andy Rashofsky, a professor emeritus of public affairs and applied economics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, was also a fellow at the Lincoln Institute for many years. Daphne and Andy, thank you for joining the conversation. Daphne, let's start with you to get a sense of what's unfolding here. How does this current scenario compare to the Great Recession and the financial crisis of 2008 and the years that followed?
Coronavirus recession may be remembered as the second deepest downturn in U.S. history. At peak, the unemployment rate in this recession, that's in April, was 14.7%, whereas the peak in the Great Recession was just under 10%. So only in the Depression were unemployment rates higher, and during the Depression, the unemployment peaked between 23 and 25%. So the recovery has begun. And in September, the national unemployment rate fell to 7.9%. That's a bit of an overstatement of the health of the economy because much of it was because of people leaving the labor force. The economy is still in a big hole. Job growth has stalled. There's a Moody's Analytics and CNN Business tracker that estimates the economy is now at 80% capacity. A key question now is, how long will it take for a recovery? It's uncertain. It depends on the course of the virus, the vaccine, and if there's additional fiscal stimulus from Congress. Right now, Moody's Analytics estimates that if there is no substantial upswing in the virus, and if new stimulus package is passed, the job recovery would take until the end of 2023. But if there's a resurgence in the virus, or no additional fiscal stimulus, we could have a double-dip recession by the end of this year, with the recovery of all jobs lost taking until at least 2027.
Andy, let's turn to what's happening now on the ground. You co-wrote an article published last month in the National Tax Journal looking at the fiscal impact of COVID for 150 cities in the Lincoln Institute database, Fiscally Standardized Cities. First, can you start by telling us what is the Fiscally Standardized Cities database and how did it help?
Central cities across the country have very different fiscal structures. So in order to be able to compare cities, fiscally compare them, we've constructed fiscally standardized cities. And we do that by combining fiscal data. So that means revenue data and spending data for city governments with a prorated share of all the overlying governments. That means independent school districts, county governments, special districts. And that, in effect, allows us to reflect the total revenue paid and the spending on behalf of all central city residents and businesses.
Now, tell us about your study. What were some of your conclusions about the fiscal impact of COVID on cities?
My co-authors, Howard Chernick and David Copeland, and I focused on the revenue shortfalls that central city governments, fiscally standard cities, are likely to face in the current fiscal year. That's fiscal year 2021. Based on past trends, we estimated each city's FY 2021 revenue as if there had been no pandemic, no COVID-19. We then calculated for each source of city revenue the likely revenue declines due to COVID-19 and the resulting recession. Because there's so much uncertainty about the course of this pandemic and the policy responses to it, we estimated two separate shortfall estimates under two sets of assumption, which we referred to as less severe and more severe. I'll summarize our main results. On average, our 150 fiscally standardized cities will face revenue shortfalls between 5.5% and 9%. We found a wide variation across the country in revenue shortfalls, not surprisingly, with the hardest hit cities facing revenue losses in excess of 15%. In dollar terms, these percentage shortfalls translate into reductions in this year's revenue in the 150 cities of between $34 and $55 billion. A rough scaling up of these estimates to all local governments across the United States suggests aggregate revenue shortfalls of between 103 and 165 billion dollars. Those are really large numbers. In general, differences in the magnitude of revenue shortfalls reflect differences in the mix of revenue sources of city governments. That means taxes, fees, miscellaneous revenues, state aid, federal aid, and differences in the incidence of COVID-19 across the country and in the severity of the recession. I think the best way to really understand why revenue shortfalls differ across cities is to give you a couple examples. I'll start with Rochester, New York, where we project revenue shortfall between 14 and 20%. Shortfalls larger than in any other city of the 150 cities. The single most important reason why Rochester will face such large shortfalls is its heavy reliance on state aid. Rochester gets nearly half of its revenue from state aid, almost double the state aid share in the average city, and we project that state aid in New York will be cut by between 21 and 27%, again, nearly twice the average across all cities. Our state aid projections are predicated on the assumption that state governments will respond to their own budget shortfalls by cutting spending rather than raising taxes. That would follow the pattern that we observed during the first year of the 2007-2009 Great Recession. The second reason that Rochester will face large revenue shortfalls is that compared to the average central city, it relies on the local sales tax more heavily than the average city. The reduction in sales tax revenue varies across cities depending upon the industry mix. So, for example, cities that rely very heavily on the tourism business are going to be particularly hard hit. In contrast, let's look at Boston. Boston will face relatively small revenue shortfall, between 2 and 4% in this upcoming fiscal year. The most important reason is Boston's heavy reliance on the property tax. Boston gets over half of its general revenue and 90% of its tax revenue from the property tax. Now, compare this for a moment to Philadelphia, which gets only about a quarter of its tax revenue from the property. Heavy reliance on the property tax is important because we project that property tax revenue this year will either not decline at all or at worst decline by 1/2. I think I need to explain why we believe it's true. Even if there is falling demand for downtown office space and central city living, people want to move out to the suburbs and avoid dense locations. Whether that's true or not is still an open question. Lower market values this year won't be reflected in lower assessed values of properties in this fiscal year. There's a lot of empirical research. Most of it comes from work on studies of the Great Recession, that because of the way property tax is administered, it takes about 3 years for reductions in housing prices to be reflected in lower property tax revenue. Bottom line is that cities such as Boston that rely heavily on the property tax will be largely protected from revenue declines this fiscal year. However, if central city property values do in fact decline, cities will suffer revenue shortfalls 2 or 3 or 4 years into the future, long after hopefully COVID-19 itself is a bad memory. But the pandemic, however, might have a long fiscal shadow.
Well, Daphne, let's take a look at the property tax, the primary source of revenue for local government in most places and a critical source of revenue for schools. Can cities and towns generally expect a little more stability in terms of the property tax and property tax revenue? And what are the perils on that front?
Anthony and Andy, you're right that the property tax is a much more stable revenue source, particularly in the near term, than state aid, income, or sales taxes. Andy mentioned the first reason, but I want to underscore that, which is that the property tax is levied on administratively determined assessed values and not directly on market values. And there's a lag between changes in assessed values and changes in market value. But there's a second reason for stability, and that is that local governments levying the property tax can raise the tax rate if the tax base shrinks. So there's really 2 reasons for the stability. Because of anticipated cuts in state aid, all local governments that rely on property taxes, and they all do, but to very different degrees, end up with greater reliance on the property tax during a recession. Now, Anthony, you asked about the perils, and I see 2. One is that not all states have an adequate system of property tax relief for people who are living in a decent-sized home but have lost their jobs. Another worry is that property tax-related fiscal disparities can lead to other disparities during a recession. And here I'm thinking about well-off school districts compared to poor school districts, and well-off school districts would have more ability and willingness to raise property tax rates and maintain good schools during a recession than their poorer counterparts.
So what to do? New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, New York State facing a nearly $15 billion shortfall, said his response would be taxes, cuts, borrowing, early retirement, all of the above. And then he added, critically, and all of the above will not fill that hole. So some states are trying to innovate their way out of the problem, for lack of a better term. New Jersey with a so-called millionaire's tax, some changes in borrowing to cover basic operating costs. In King County, Washington State, around Seattle, proposed a new sales tax dedicated to housing and homelessness. Andy, let's start with you. Will we see more of these kinds of measures on the revenue side, and how would they help?
Anthony, you've pointed out a few examples of state governments taking steps to raise revenue to fill their budget gaps. These examples are likely to be quite rare. Most state governments are not considering taxing, although we are likely to see a rise at the state level and at the local level in user fees and charges. Most states are responding to budget shortfalls by cutting spending rather than raising taxes. And I might add that states relying on, and local governments in particular, relying on extra borrowing is quite risky, and generally economists think that's a really bad idea, a bad way to fill a budget gap. State and local governments have already reduced spending in large part by cutting public employment. Between February, the month before the beginning of the pandemic, and September, state and local government employment in the US has declined by 1.2 million people. That's a decline of 6.1%. Although most state governments are trying hard to maintain public services with fewer employees, especially in education, the quality and level of public services will almost certainly decline. As Daphne mentioned, another way state governments are balancing their budgets, as they're required to do, is by reducing aid to their local government. The largest impacts are likely to be on school districts. Local governments are, in general, responding by reducing public spending, modest increases in property tax rates, Daphne suggested, reliance on rainy day funds, and by furloughing some public employees, requiring those employees to take days off without pay.
Daphne, anything to add on the revenue side?
My thought is that since property tax relief is likely to be such a big problem as the recession continues, I wonder if there might finally be more uptake of property tax deferral options or expansion of those options. And let me just remind you what property tax deferral is. If I took up a property tax deferral option, that would mean I don't pay my property taxes now when they're due, but wait until I sell my house and then I pay the taxes along with interest. For a long time, not many people have availed themselves of these options, but also they're not very generous, and they could be made more generous. Leisha Manel of Boston College has long pushed a major expansion of property tax deferral, along with funding the property tax deferral by issuing bonds. And here I would push back a little bit on Andy's statement. If you're ever going to push the boundaries on borrowing, it should be now when interest rates are almost zero. State and local governments need to be careful, but this is a nearly impossible situation.
So state and local governments can try to raise revenue, they can borrow in different ways, they can cut jobs and services, but these shortfalls are so big, and a lot of states already had massive unfunded pension obligations and the like. That's what's really struck me about Andrew Cuomo's comments, that even dramatic austerity wouldn't even fix the problem. So we come back to this idea of stimulus and federal assistance, which is now apparently not forthcoming. Let me pose this final question in a cold-eyed kind of way. Everybody claims their functions are critical to the economy, the airline industry, for example, restaurants and retail, arguably. What is it about states and cities that make them so important to keep afloat in this perilous time? Andy, let's start with you, and Daphne, you'll have the last word.
First and foremost, state and local governments provide the public with a wide range of public services upon which rest their health, safety, and economic well-being. Just let me give a few examples. Police protection, fire protection, public health, particularly important now, sanitation, water supply, sewage, street and road maintenance, public transport, elementary, secondary, and higher education, recreation, environmental protection. And lest we forget the key to maintaining our democracy, running elections or local government function. Reductions in these services will have real consequences for our health and safety, for everyone. Equally true for the most needy among us. A substantial number of public employees are essential workers. They're putting their lives at risk on a daily basis. Let me also emphasize that there's a real long-lasting consequence of reduced public services. I'll just give you one example. There's good evidence that children who fail to get high-quality education for even a short period of time fall behind academically. The consequences are felt for their whole lives in the form of less completed education and lower lifetime earnings. That's serious stuff. Another lesson from the Great Recession is that the category of spending that sustained the largest cuts during the Great Recession was capital investment. And state and local governments put off essential capital projects and deferred maintenance. That's likely to happen this time too. The consequences are sometimes catastrophic. unsafe drinking water, think of Flint, Michigan, collapsing bridges, ruptured dams. Finally, let me emphasize a point that Daphne made. Reductions in public employment will hurt the economy and slow economic recovery. To put the problem in perspective, in September, state and local governments had 18.7 million employees. That's after, remember, a decline this year of 1.2 million. My bottom line is that the nation will pay a very heavy price if the Congress and the administration cannot agree on substantial additional federal relief targeted to state and local governments.
Daphne, why shouldn't we just let cities and states figure it out, sink or swim?
For one thing, so many state and local workers are on the front lines of battling the pandemic. This includes public health workers and workers in public hospitals. Another way to put the importance of state and local workers in the economy is to note that 1 in 7 or 8 workers in the entire economy work in state and local government. So any layoffs in state and local government impact the broader economy in an important way. If state and local fiscal distress leads to state and local job cuts and tax cuts, this could place drag on the general economic recovery, and it could even tip the economy into a double-dip recession. So we've come out a bit, we could go back into the recession. One other thing to note is that in the so-called Great Recession, Congress passed ERA, which was a fiscal stimulus. They passed it early on, but the package ran out of money before the economic recovery was complete. And as a result, state and local cuts and lack of hiring helped prolong the path to fiscal recovery. So we should help our policymakers learn from the mistake of the last recession.
Daphne Kenyon and Andy Rashofsky, thank you so much for sharing all your insights and research. That's it for this episode of the Land Matters podcast. We're committed to investigating all the issues related to cities and land policy in these extraordinary times. I'm your host, Anthony Flint. Thanks for listening.